Okay, thank you, Runa. I will talk about the Euopeana data model, and I will talk about both constraints and opportunities in that context. And before I start, I want to thank Francesca for introducing two terms that will be reoccurring in my presentation. One is knowledge, the other is digital humanities. So this is the overview. I will start with the big picture, the context in which the EDM was actually conceived. I will say a few words on the EDM itself, introduce it briefly for those of you who are not yet familiar with it, and then I will have a last slide which is on opportunities this model actually creates. The big picture is the picture we had in mind when we finished the EDLnet project, when we were starting Euopeana 1.0. And this picture I have used quite often was this one. It was to develop Euopeana as a two-layer thing with object representations and semantic context and the user in between these two, so that the object representations would have a rich semantic context. And this contextualization, in the end, would turn Euopeana into what I have called a knowledge generation engine. This is about contextualization. That was one of the big ideas we had in mind when starting to think about the EDM. The second was this one, the fact that we have to deal with different communities, very different ways of conceiving objects and what they actually are, so that we need bridges between these aisles of information. And there again, the idea was to use semantic contextualization as such bridges. And the third vision was this one. By the time already, we had this ambition to make Euopeana ultimately part of the linked open data cloud that has been referred to quite often already today. So these were three big ideas. And then there were more requirements. Actually, many of you may remember where Euopeana actually historically came from in a way that is illustrated here. That was the Canard enchaîné in 2005. That was when Google Books started off, and when Google Books actually made Chirac and Schröder write letters to the Commission, and then the Commission promising something. That was in 2005, promising a European digital library. And then in 2008, the Commission actually wanted to launch this thing, and we had to come up with something very quickly, and that was the ESE. The ESE, which has been often criticized, was necessary for this first prototype of Euopeana. It enforces interoperability by converting datasets to a very flat representation. You could euphemistically call it simple and robust, but it had a number of drawbacks. The original metadata are not visible anymore. There is no way to specialize it into finer-grained models. And there is no connection, that's the worst of them, to external open data resources. And by the way, I repeat, we probably shouldn't have called that semantic, because it was everything but semantic. So that was the fourth driver for the EDM, to avoid the problems the ESE had created. And therefore, we talked a lot to our experts. We had sessions with different user communities. And what emerged from these were a number of requirements and design principles. The first of them being that we would need to really distinguish the real object, the book, the picture, or whatsoever, and its digital representation. that we would need to distinguish clearly between object properties and descriptive metadata. Two things that seem very trivial, they are not. For any of you who knows the data we get, they're not. We had to enable several perspectives of objects, support complex composite objects, and create a standard for metadata and vocabularies with specializing options. And we wanted to make a maximum reuse of existing standards, such as, I'll go over this very quickly, SCOS, DC terms, or most importantly, OAI, ORE. Now, we then came up with a number of classes and properties which now enable us to model objects differently. This is Unimark in its sheer beauty. Baudelaire, this is the way it's presented at Gallica, and this is the way it shows up in the EDM. We have the physical thing here, the cultural heritage object, we have a proxy, we have the digital representations, we have semantic context, and the aggregation node that pulls all this together, connected to a complex graph structure. And you can use this graph structure also to model events, such as in this example here, or to model complex objects and their properties, such as in this example here of two different editions being connected by a is derivative of property. And of course, the whole thing is not disruptive, so you can also migrate ESE to this EDM, and the linked data pilot we now have was created that way in migrating ESE to the EDM. The status, we have confirmed feasibility. We have the linked open data pilot, which is already based on the EDM, rolling out in the portal, in the back office area is still to come, and there is documentation. And most importantly, once again, it's now part of this cloud. And this brings me to my last slide. I've talked a bit about design principles, about requirements. Now there are opportunities that are created this way. And these are things we may discuss in the panel discussion later again. First of all, the evident ones, of course. The EDM is the precondition for the reuse of Euopeana data in the linked open data cloud. So we give something to that community, and the reuse of the linked open data cloud data within Euopeana. That's trivial. It's quite powerful, but trivial. There is something more sophisticated, an opportunity that I see created by the EDM. That is the potential of making Euopeana a primary source for the digital humanities community. Since this is RDF, you can reason on it, you can create heuristics operating over this data set, so you can provide scholarly heuristics building on linked open data, and that brings a new quality to Euopeana. And finally, the EDM is a very important condition for doing something I feel vitally necessary for Euopeana, reducing data flows. We can link instead of replicate data. And that way, we may actually be able to manage Euopeana on the long run. If you imagine all the data flows that would result from constant replication, you end up with a nightmare. Instead, the EDM is the precondition for a truly distributed data architecture, and we'll be working on that in version 2. Thank you.